Hey, everybody. You ready for the next one? We're going to get through Genesis today. So just to recap, God gave humans every single plant. After the flood, he gave us every single animal, both clean and unclean. We had specific mention of bread, unleavened bread, wine, milk, curds, meat, feasting, lentils. I think that was it so far. Okay, we're going to pick it up. In Genesis 26:30, it says, "So he made them a feast, and they ate and drank." So there's another feast. I think that's the third mention of feasting. All right, so the next mention of food is in Genesis 27, verse 3 and 4. "Now then, take your weapons, your quiver and your bow, and go out to the field and hunt game for me, and prepare for me delicious food, such as I love, and bring it to me so that I may eat, that my soul may bless you before I die." So this is Isaac talking to his son Esau, telling him to go out and find some game. This is the first mention of game, specifically, of hunting. Other than Nimrod, it seems like this is the first mention of a hunter, specifically. This is the first mention of delicious food. Seems like Isaac really had a thing for food. All right, so then we go to verses 7 and 10. "Bring me game and prepare for me delicious food, that I may eat it and bless you before the Lord before I die." More delicious game. So now this is Rebecca telling her son Jacob to trick his dad. And she says, "Go to the flock and bring me 2 good young goats, so that I may prepare from them delicious food for your father, such as he loves. And you shall bring it to your father to eat, so that he may bless you before he dies." 2 young goats apparently tastes like game, whatever game he was hunting. Or he was just so old that he couldn't tell the difference. So we're still in chapter 27. 27 has a lot. Verse 25. "Then he said, bring it near to me." This is Isaac talking to Jacob, who he thinks is Esau. "Bring it near to me, that I may eat of my son's game and bless you." So he brought it near to him, and he ate. And he brought him wine, and he drank. So delicious food and wine now. 28b, in his blessing, in Isaac's blessing that he gives to Jacob, thinking that he's Esau, he says, "May God give you the dew of heaven and of the fatness of the earth, and plenty of grain and wine." Fatness of the earth, grain and wine, given to him as a blessing, specifically. All right, and that's it for chapter 27. So we move on to 28. Verse 18 says, "So early in the morning, Jacob took the stone that he had put under his head and set it up for a pillar and poured oil on the top of it." This is the very first mention of oil, which would have been olive oil. Verse 20, "Jacob made a vow saying, if God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat, and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God." All right, the next one is chapter 29, verse 22. This is when Laban tricks Jacob into marrying Leah instead of marrying Rachel like he wanted and worked 7 years for. So Jacob, the trickster, is getting a lesson in trickery because his father-in-law is very tricksy. All right, so verse 22 says, "So Laban gathered together all the people of the place and made a feast." And then it says, "In the evening, he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob." Now, I'm pretty sure wine was involved in that feast, or else Jacob might have noticed that, hey, this isn't Rachel, this is her sister. So we're going to move on to chapter 30. Chapter 30, verse 14 says, "In the days of the wheat harvest," so specifically wheat, "Reuben went and found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah." What are mandrakes? They've been used in medicine, magic, and anesthesia. They're mentioned in the Bible. The fruit, so this is actually what she had. The fruit of the mandrake is a berry that is yellow to orange when ripe and resembles a small tomato. They've been used as a sleep inducer, painkiller, and anesthetic. In the Mediterranean, they were believed to promote fertility. There's a reason that she's picking these mandrakes. Back to chapter 30, verse 14. "In the days of the wheat harvest, Reuben went and found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, 'Please give me some of your son's mandrakes.' But she said to her, 'Is it a small matter that you have taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also?' Rachel said, 'Then he may lie with you tonight in exchange for your son's mandrakes.' When Jacob came home from the field in the evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, "You must come in to me, for I have hired you with my son's mandrakes." So he lay with her that night. And God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. Leah said, "God has given me my wages, because I gave my servant to my husband." So she called his name Issachar. And then it says that God remembered Rachel and listened to her and opened her womb. And she conceived and bore a son and said, "God has taken away my reproach." So it is thought that that's why she wanted the mandrakes, was for fertility, and she was willing to give away pleasure in order to have children. I can't imagine how all these women and men got along together with this kind of relationship, but 31 verses 45 to 54. Okay, that's a lot. So Jacob has just run away from Laban, took his wives and all his children, the flocks that he was supposed to get that Laban tried to keep from him, and all of this. So now they're coming together and they're making a pact. And Jacob took a stone and set it up as a pillar and said to his kinsmen, "Gather stones." So they made a heap. And then he said, "This heap is a witness between you and me today." Therefore he named it Galeed and Mitzpah, for he said, "The Lord watch between you and me when we are out of one another's sight." And so God is a witness. And then it says, the heap in 51, Laban said to Jacob, "See this heap and the pillar which I have set between you and me. This heap is a witness, and the pillar is a witness, that I won't pass over this heap to you, and you won't pass over this heap to me to do harm." So in verse 54, Jacob offered a sacrifice in the hill country and called his kinsmen to eat bread. They ate bread and spent the night in the hill country. So a meal is used to consecrate a covenant, a deal. So now we're in 41. So this is Joseph. He's already in Egypt. In 41 verse 36, it says that food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through famine. In verse 48, it says, "And he gathered up all the food of these 7 years, the plentiful years, which occurred in the land of Egypt, and put the food in the cities. He put in every city the food from the fields around it." Verses 56 and 57, it says, "So when the famine had spread all over the land, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, all the earth came to Egypt to buy grain." So there it specifies that it's grain, because the famine was severe over all the earth. And that's one really cool thing about grain: wheat berries, barley, rye, rice, things like that. Everything is self-contained. It's got everything it needs to begin a new life, to create more wheat plants or more barley or more rye. But it also keeps all of the nutrients inside of it safe and whole, so that when you grind it up to make bread, then all the nutrients are released. But the grain will store in its dormant dry grain form for a long, long time, like 20 years. And they only had to store it for 7. Joseph saved the whole world through this scheme of saving everything during the years of plenty. So we should take a note from this. And when we have a little bit of excess and when we're going through years of plenty, we need to be storing up grain for years of hardship, which are coming. Chapter 43. So now we have some specifics. The famine was severe in the land. Okay. They've already gone to Egypt to buy food from Joseph. Joseph treated them like spies. He's getting a little bit of comeuppance there. And so their father said to them, "Go again, buy us a little food." But Judah said to him, "The man solemnly warned us, saying, 'You will not see my face again unless your brother's with you.'" And so, this is a whole big deal when they're having this conversation about going back to Egypt. In verse 11, it says, "Then their father Israel said to them, 'If it must be so, then do this. Take some of the choice fruits of the land in your bags and carry a present down to the man, a little balm and a little honey,'" first mention of honey, "gum, myrrh, pistachio nuts, and almonds." So all of this, first mention of all of these things. Balm and gum and myrrh aren't actually foods necessarily, but they had ceremonial uses and medicinal uses. Honey, yum. pistachio nuts and almonds. And they had livestock too. So they had livestock plus all of this stuff. And he's saying, go to Egypt or we're going to die. So it's not like they didn't have food, but it seems like they didn't have the right kind of food to support the livestock and the humans. So they needed grain. They probably needed grain to feed their livestock as well as themselves. So this is the first mention of all these things. And it's to give as a gift to Egypt in return for grain to save their lives. That's how important grain was. And then in 43:16, it says, when Joseph saw Benjamin with them, he said to the steward of his house, bring the men into the house and slaughter an animal and make ready, for the men are to dine with me at noon. So they're eating fresh meat at lunch. Verse 25, they prepared the present for Joseph's coming at noon, for they heard that they should eat bread there. So eating bread seems to be just like a term for eating food. They probably had bread with every meal. And then in chapter 45, verse 23, it mentions food again. To his father he sent as follows, 10 donkeys loaded with the good things of Egypt, and 10 female donkeys loaded with grain, bread, and provision for his father on the journey. And then in chapter 47, verse 13, it says, now there was no food in all the land, for the famine was very severe, probably brought on by drought, so that the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished by reason of the famine. So Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan in exchange for the grain that they bought. And Joseph brought all the money into Pharaoh's house. First, because of this famine, they give the government all of their money for food. And then they're out of money, so they give the government all of their livestock in exchange for food. And then they run out of that. And so they give their land in exchange for food. And then finally they give their very lives, their selves, in exchange for food. This is how bad it got. Joseph and his family didn't have to exchange anything, and the priests of Egypt didn't have to exchange anything. They were just fed. But the typical Egyptians who had not prepared, they had to sell even their very person in return for food during these 7 years. So in order to avoid doing that with our government or any other government, store your own grain. Be prepared in case of famine, because it happens. And we know at the end of the Bible, famine's coming. So it's good to be prepared. I mean, it would be good to have livestock and fruit trees and all of that too, but not everyone can do that. But everyone can store some grain in their house. Verse 23 of 47, it says, Joseph said to the people, behold, I have this day bought you and your land for Pharaoh. Now here is seed for you, and you shall sow the land. So from that grain that he stored up, they were able to plant again once the famine is over and harvest, but now they have to give a fifth of everything that they grow to Pharaoh as payment for this time that he kept them alive. I think we can probably get through Exodus 2. Exodus 2 verse 20 says, he said to his daughters, then where is he? Why have you left the man? Call him, that he may eat bread. There's bread again. Exodus chapter 3 verse 8, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Here's the first mention of milk and honey together, and it's in a promise to Moses. And it's in regards to delivering the Israelites from Egypt and bringing them into the land of Canaan, which is now Israel. Exodus 12, we get to the lamb. Exodus 12, 3 through 6. Tell all the congregation of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, every man shall take a lamb according to their father's houses, a lamb for a household. And if the household is too small for a lamb, then he and his nearest neighbor shall take according to the number of persons, according to what each can eat. You shall make your count for the lamb. The lamb shall be without blemish, a male a year old. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats, and you shall keep it until the 14th day of this month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill their lambs at twilight. So, on the 10th day of the month, you go and find a lamb or a goat, and you bring it into your house. It has to be a male, less than a year old, without spot or blemish. You kept it in your house, so you can imagine this cute little lamb baby, less than a year old. You get to know it. It's in your house for 4 days, and then you have to kill it. Jesus is the lamb. This whole Passover thing is a foretaste of what Jesus is going to fulfill when he came. And he was the Passover lamb. He was offered on Passover day, which wasn't a Friday, by the way. They shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. They shall eat the flesh at night, roasted on the fire with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled in water, but roasted, its head with its legs and inner parts. And you shall let none of it remain until the morning. Anything that remains until the morning you shall burn. So in this manner you shall eat it, with your belt fastened, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste. Unleavened bread you can whip together really quick because you don't have to wait for it to rise or anything. There's no rising agent. So it's literally just flour, water, salt, and you bake it. So it's the bread of haste. And this was their rehearsal for when they were actually going to evacuate, which is coming up. Chapter 13, verses 5 through 8. When the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, which he swore to your fathers to give you, which is the land of Israel right now, a land flowing with milk and honey. And he's saying that you're going to keep this feast every year. For 7 days you'll eat unleavened bread, and on the 7th day there will be a feast to the Lord. Chapter 16, verse 4. So then the Lord said to Moses, Behold, I am about to rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may test them whether they will walk in my law or not. On the 6th day, when they prepare what they bring in, it'll be twice as much as they gather daily. The people were to gather this bread, this manna stuff, which was like little seeds. They gathered it in and they made bread for that day. Unless it was the 6th day, then they gathered twice as much and they made enough for the next day, which was the Sabbath, when they weren't supposed to do any work and couldn't gather. Verse 12, it says, I've heard the grumbling of the people of Israel. Say to them, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread. So they didn't just want this angel bread. They wanted meat. So God gave them quail. In the evening, the quail would come and they would just drop dead onto the ground. Can you imagine having to break down tiny little quail every day that you wanted to eat meat? I think I'd prefer the manna. But either way, they had to work to get their food in the wilderness, but God took care of them. They lacked for nothing. Their clothes didn't wear out. They were given the bread of angels, and they were given quail. And all they did was complain. Now, in chapter 18, verse 12, and Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought a burnt offering and sacrifices to God, and Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law before God. Chapter 23, 14 and 16, he's telling them about the feasts. There are 3 main feasts that they have to appear at. You keep the Feast of Unleavened Bread, that's Passover, and that whole 7-day week of unleavened bread. In the month of Abib, the first month, the month they came out of Egypt. Then the Feast of Harvest, which is the first fruits of the labor. And then the Feast of Ingathering at the end of the year. So you had Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles. Basically, those are the 3 feasts that they are required to go to and participate in. And that the Feast of Ingathering is the Feast of the Fruits. So you have the barley harvest, the wheat harvest, and then the fruit harvest, essentially. Verse 18, it says, You shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with anything leavened, or let the fat of my feast remain until the morning. So you had to eat all of it, and no leavened bread during this time. The best of the first fruits of the ground you shall bring into the house of the Lord your God. So not just the leavings, you're supposed to bring the first and the best. And then the weirdest verse and completely out of context. Verse 19, the best of the first fruits of your ground you shall bring into the house of the Lord your God. You shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. Why? Why would they want to? It does seem kind of like really rude to boil a young goat in its mother's milk. Like, that just seems cruel and weird that he had to say that. What I think is that it was some sort of an Egyptian thing. I don't really know. I have not learned the answer to that. It symbolizes the mixing of life, the mother's milk meant to nourish the young, with death, the act of cooking the animal for consumption, representing a violation of the natural order and a lack of reverence for life, particularly in the context of the Jewish faith. Chapter 24, verses 9 through 11 says, Then Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel went up, and they saw the God of Israel. There was under his feet, as it were, a pavement of sapphire stones, like the very heaven for clearness. And he did not lay his hand on the chief people of Israel. They beheld God, and ate and drank. They saw God, and ate and drank to celebrate. So that's episode 2. Now, we'll start in Exodus 29 next time, and that goes into specifically the requirements for sacrifices. So God food, basically. Not that God's actually eating it, but he says he likes the smell of it. And these were laws. These were meant to be followed. So they're important. And we'll pick it up next time there.
With this skill, this will keep you from heresy, and keep you from going through theological therapy. The words of God will change your life.